Good morning, everyone. This is 10 Years Hence. Our focus this morning moves from collaborative intelligence to resilience. Our speaker this morning is Elliott Parker, who comes to us from Chicago. Elliott is CEO of High Alpha, earned a Bachelor of Science in Finance from Brigham Young University, or an MBA from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Elliott built his career in strategy, consulting and insight, the firm founded by Clayton Christensen, whom I met and worked with at Harvard. The genius of the guy. He helped dozens of Fortune 100 companies build and execute their innovation strategies. Elliott joined his friends in Alpha, the Indianapolis-based venture studio, to lead business design and corporate innovation. After some years of building within the event studio model, he spun the team out to bring their playbook to corporations, universities, and governments. Elliott is the author of The Illusion of Innovation, Escape Efficiency, and Capture Radical Progress. The book highlights the opportunity for scaled organizations to unlock transformation through rapid experimentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Elliott Parker.
Nice to be here with you all today. It's a fun opportunity. On the syllabus online, you may have seen my colleague Matt Rove, who was also being here. We run a venture fund, a venture studio with everything called 1842. I'm happy to be here. This is a hot topic. 10 years hence is a really interesting idea. I wish I could stand up here and tell you exactly what to do in 10 years. I wish I knew. All I know is the world is going to be much weirder than we could possibly imagine. I'm going to explain why. And I think the best strategy in preparation for that is simply to prepare for anything that we can, because we can't predict what problems are going to arise. We just need to take a stance of problem fixing rather than a stance of problem avoiding. I'll explain why to you. Let me start with two stories. First story is about my friend named Paul. Paul is from Haiti. And back when Paul was in college in Haiti, in the early 2000s, one of his professors was asked by the government, and this professor liked Paul, and so asked Paul to be part of this group that was going to put together the plan for the country of Haiti to be prepared for anything that might arise, any type of natural disaster that would come up. And so this group got together and thought, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to think about what type of natural disaster are we going to imagine. And so they sat down and we thought about volcanoes. I haven't been volcano eruptions in Haiti for tens of thousands of years, maybe longer than that, so maybe not that. Hurricanes happen often enough and people know what to do. That's not serious enough. Earthquakes happen from time to time in Haiti. They sat there, the very worst natural disaster they could imagine as a prompt for designing their emergency response plan was, this is going to be funny with people in South Bend, inches of snow in 24 hours. 12 inches of snow fell on Haiti in 24 hours. This would be a disaster. They're right. It would be a disaster. Now, it's a crazy, far-fetched thing, and they selected us for that reason, because it was going to push their thinking in terms of what was possible. But the plan consisted of kind of the steps you would take to prepare for a big snowstorm. You're going to need shovels, and you're going to need blankets, and where would we get these things, and where would we store them, and all these things. Came up with a great plan for the country. They put it on a shelf somewhere. Now, the irony of it is that years later, in 2010, the worst earthquake in modern history hit Haiti, and the country was very unprepared. 7.0 earthquake, estimates are that at least 100,000 people died. The main road in Haiti just was blocked for 10 days. It took a week for radio stations to come back online. Just a terrible disaster. In some ways predictable, but another, and they were not ready. I'm going to come back to this because a lot of our large organizations are similarly unprepared for the types of problems that they're going to experience in the next decade. Story number two, last year I was in Japan, where we're launching companies right now. And I had the opportunity to go to Kyoto, where there's this amazing ancient temple that was built, if I remember right, 1,400 years ago, something like that. It's incredibly old. And this temple, to maintain the aspects of the temple, they use traditional construction techniques. And so every 15 years, the wooden floors are replaced with these ancient techniques. And when we were there, I think last year, They just finished replacing the wooden floors in this temple. The floors were replaced with wood that is harvested from camphor trees grown in the hills surrounding this temple that are grown specifically for this purpose. And the trees that they harvested were planted back in the 1600s to be used on the flooring last year. And what they told us was really interesting is that at the same time, they were planting trees to be harvested in the 25th century for the same purpose, to be used in the floor. And I think that type of long-term thinking is really remarkable. It's unusual, but it helps provide a really unique perspective. It's a unique way to interact with the world. I don't know about you, but I want to build things that last a long time and have a positive impact. I want to be a good ancestor for people who are yet to come. I think inside of us, we all have a desire to build things that can endure. The problem is most of our organizations are not designed to endure. They're not designed to be resilient. They're not designed to be able to deal with the types of unforeseen problems that can arise. So I'm going to talk about why that's important, why we're going to see an acceleration of this in the next decade, and then what we can do about it. So we'll talk about three things today. First is the importance of messiness and embracing messiness. Number two, how critical it is to be running experiments. Those experiments help us learn, uncover anomalies, gather knowledge. And it's that knowledge that leads to serendipity. And it's through serendipity that our organizations become resilient in the face of crises or opportunities. We'll talk about some stories from nature, ancient history a little bit. And we'll talk about a company called Vallejo, which is a really nice, does anybody know what Vallejo does? Vallejo makes parts for automobiles. So they're in the automobile supply chain. And back during COVID, I was doing some research into companies. As Jim mentioned, I run a business that builds startups for the corporations as a way to help them be more resilient and innovate in ways they can't on their own. And so I was doing some research on COVID into companies and how they were dealing with the crisis. And I thought it might be fun to go back and look at press releases from companies just before COVID happened, because nobody expected this. This was a surprise. And it was interesting. Right before COVID is all the things you would expect, how amazing our companies performing, all the things we're doing. In the case of Vallejo, talking about what they were doing in China, the new plants they were opening. And then right after the crisis hit, of course, the press releases were very different. It took you on the tone. In the case of Vallejo, John Ashenberg was the CEO at the time. He said, before COVID, we produced 8 million products a day, 3 billion components, 191 plants around the world. That is crazy. That is remarkable. That is an amazing feat of human ingenuity. If you think about it, tens of thousands of people dedicating their careers to incremental improvements in the system that led to a system where globally you would have 191 factories in all these different countries around the world producing 8 million parts a day in a super capital efficient way. And I think about we think a lot about the Great Pyramids of Egypt. That's sure, those are amazing. Never get the chance to go. They're amazing. This is amazing and not heralded. This supply chain is remarkable. And it was incredibly capital efficient. I mean, there's very little waste, very little error in a system until all of a sudden the crisis hit. And that system was now no longer capital efficient. It failed. The system wasn't resilient. It was so efficient, in fact, that it was actually really fragile. And when a crisis came, it failed. A lot of our organizations are in a similar state, whether they're universities, corporations, governments. They're so optimized for efficiency and avoidance of error that they've become very fragile. Let me give you an example of why I believe this. If you look at right now, we've decided in the last 50, 60 years that the primary method by which we measure the success of companies is a formula called return on invested capital. It's a formula that says you put $1 in and you get $1 plus something back out. And because that's become the primary metric by which we measure the success of companies, our companies have become very good at generating capital. There's more money on corporate balance sheets than ever before in the history of humanity. As of a couple of years ago, $6.9 trillion on the balance sheets of companies. So companies are making more money than they ever have before. But at the same time, they're also going out of business faster. And that's a really interesting paradox. You would think if they're making more money, they'd be thriving and surviving and enduring longer. The opposite is true. They're making more money, but also going out of business faster on average. What do we make of this? What we can learn is that our corporations are indeed very good at managing for capital efficiency, at generating profits. But perhaps that pursuit of profits, so much capital efficiency, like leads to fragility, corporations are not able to deal with the things in front of them. And I think we all have a sense that this might be true, right? We can all think of stories where large institutions, governments, corporations, whatever they might be, somehow seem to be more capable at dealing with change, with opportunities, with challenges 50, 100 years ago than they are today. All sorts of fun anecdotal stories about that. We need our corporations to succeed. There are certain types of problems that can only be dealt with through massive human coordination, and corporations are a vehicle through which we do that. So as long as corporations are generating societal surplus, we need them to exist and succeed. But in the room right now, some of the technology, for example, these are things that can be created by corporations like Vallejo with their supply chains. A startup can't do this. And so it's important that corporations thrive as long as they're generating that societal surplus. The problem is that we're optimizing our corporations for the wrong thing. We're doing really good at managing them, and we're managing them for the wrong outcomes, for capital efficiency rather than for resilience. And this is the formula that gets applied. We think that we can simultaneously reduce the errors we encounter in a system or avoid errors while increasing the number of insights we're going to gather as a group. This formula does not work. This is impossible. In fact, as you reduce the errors in the system, you also reduce the amount of learning that system is producing. After you get out of school, you go work for a company. If you were working at a company where there are no errors, you're working at a company that is dying. I tell corporate executives all the time, it may feel good in the short term to have a company that is avoiding errors. But the reality is you're a corporate hospice worker. You're in a sterile environment. Sterility is death. Mistakes that make us human, make us alive, the same is true of organizations. Errors and mistakes generate the insights we need to learn, whether that's individually or as organizations. Once that learning, we'll talk about, helps produce the resilience that we need. They give you an example of this. Anybody know this is? She was guy before, he's semi-famous. This is a guy named Hafthor Bjorn, sometimes called the Mountain, is his nickname. He is 6'9" tall, and in this video, he weighs 450 pounds. That is not his normal weight. He over a couple of years, put his body through tremendous stress so that in this video, he could break the world record for heaviest deadlift. Over 1,100 pounds he's lifting right here. And the funny part about this story is he did it. This is out of spite. There's a guy in England who previously held the record. He wanted to beat him just to show this guy Luna that he could do better. So he beat him by a kilo. The old record was 500 kilograms, and Thor did 501. After he got down with the lift, he said he could have done more, but he wanted to just beat this other guy. Now, to prepare for this, he had to put his body through just crazy amount of difficulty that he had to choose on purpose for a couple of years. He had to eat 10,000 calories a day. That's one example. That's 5 or 6 enormous meals every day that he was eating. That sounds like, yeah, that'd be fun. No, it was fun. That was a hard work. Eating 10,000 calories a day for a couple of years, you would be so sick of it. He had to go through these strenuous workouts where he was tearing down muscle so that the muscle could rebuild, creating new connections between his brain and his muscles so that he could break the world record for the heavy. Now, he had certain qualities that made him more likely than any of us in this room to break the world record. 6'9", at the time of the lift, he is 450 pounds. But he had to choose hardship. He had to choose difficulty to be able to do this incredibly amazing thing that nobody had ever done before. The same is true of any endeavor in our lives. If we want to learn, if we want to accomplish big things, we have to be willing to put a system under stress. In our organizations, if we want our organizations to grow and to learn and adapt, the same is true. We also need our organizations to undergo some stress deliberately, hopefully. Sometimes it's not deliberate, but the organizations need stress in order to learn and to grow. This is really important because the world is changing quickly. Anybody seen these pictures before? I think this is remarkable. That's amazing.
The chief of communication for the Vatican, guy around the press office. And I saw this about 2015, and it was just astounding.
So I put these pictures up because this is one example of many where the world is changing around us really quickly. And when we're in the middle of it, sometimes we don't notice it. But here's an example we've all lived through, I think. I don't know, is anybody born after 2005? So we're all alive during this time period. One day that won't be true, and I'll show these pictures too. But in 2005, if you look at that picture of the people at St. Peter's, you can see that some signs of what was to come. You can see some people holding up flip phones. 8 years later, nearly every single person in that room has a smartphone that is changing the way these people interact with the world around them in a pretty fundamental way. And if you'd asked people back in that moment, it was pretty gradual. You didn't feel the change. Back and look over that 8 years, this is a remarkable change in the way that humans interact with each other. There's so many things like this happening right now that in the moment, it's hard for us to see. I'll give you a couple more examples. The future is going to be, this is coming back to the 10 years hence. What can we say about the world 10 years from now? All I can say is the future is going to be much weirder than any of us can imagine. It's going to get here a lot faster than we think. Let me explain why. I love ancient history. I was just with my parents last week. My mom is doing graduate work in Egyptology, which is a passion of hers. She had a book called Innovation during the reign of, can't remember which Egyptian. Every ancient civilization, and the reason is that those civilizations did not innovate fast enough. And what I mean by that is they didn't gather enough knowledge and wealth to be able to deal with the problems that arose. The problems stacked up over time. And ultimately, some problem came in the form of some other people or some natural disaster that the civilization was incapable of dealing with because they did not have the wealth, the means, the will, or the knowledge for how to deal with this, and the civilization failed. If they had innovated fast enough, if they gathered enough knowledge and wealth along the way, they would have been able to deal with these problems. So a couple of things to learn from this. This is also true of our companies, by the way. No company ever went out of business because it learned too fast or too much. If you look at what happened through ancient history and these civilizations that failed, one of the lessons, takeaways that problems number one are that all problems are solvable within the laws of physics. And you might argue as well that every problem that comes is beneficial in its ability to drive progress in society. So problems are inevitable, all problems are solvable, problems are beneficial drivers of progress. Now, if you recognize that's going to happen, we're going to encounter problems we can't yet predict, like my friend in Haiti. The only thing you can do to prepare is to focus on gathering as much knowledge about how the world works and as much wealth to be able to be prepared for anything that might arise, including things that you can't yet predict. And so this then becomes an important way to think about how we operate our corporations as well, maybe even how we operate our lives. Focus on gathering knowledge and gathering wealth to be prepared for any problem that might arise. The future is not predetermined. Our society that exists right now, it isn't predetermined that society will exist forever. It's important that we collectively focus on gathering knowledge and wealth to ensure our society continue to thrive and solve problems that might arise. Like asteroids hitting the Earth and on that. So why is the world going to be weirder than we can imagine? Let me just walk through what drives pace of innovation, because this is foundational to understand what we do about it. Go back to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt survived for 3,500 years. And that civilization was relatively static. And if you were an ancient Egyptian living in 3000 BC or an ancient Egyptian living in 500 BC, it wasn't all that different. Similar religious beliefs, similar clothing, similar technologies and tools. Why did it progress so slowly? Well, the reason is when Egypt started out, they had to invent things like spoons and tables. They invented marshmallows too, by the way. They had to invent things like this that didn't exist before. They didn't have the building blocks that we benefit from now. And they also didn't have the connectivity. There weren't that many people, and it wasn't easy to communicate. So they weren't able to share ideas. So what drives progress is, number one, the amount of connectivity in a system. How many people are in that system and how well connected are they? How able are they to share ideas? Number two, how many building blocks do they have, or how many ideas do they have to share with each other? As those two things increase, the pace of innovation increases. All right. So there's a futurist guy named Kurzweil stated this pretty well. I said, the rate of change of progress accelerates because humans can use the technology at their disposal to progress faster than previous generations could without the technology. Now note that she does not say the amount of technology increases, the amount of progress increases. He says the rate of change accelerates. This is not a linear growth. As you get more connectivity and more building blocks of ideas, the pace of change goes like this. And so think about the world that we're living in right now. Hold on a second. There's more communication, more nodes in the network, more people, more ability to communicate than ever before, and more ideas to share. What happens in a world when anyone can share any idea with anybody else on the planet anytime for free? And the answer is we don't know. This has never happened before, but we're living in it right now. Back to the picture of the phones. This is an example of a growth curve, an exponential growth curve that we're living through and processing. Let me give you an example of a couple of growth curves I think are interesting. When I was growing up, you had to be careful about which phone numbers you dialed, because if you dialed a number outside your local area into another area code, the phone company would charge you extra money for that phone call. And it's a crazy thing to think about now. If you look at the history of communication in the United States or around the world, it's pretty interesting to see the drop in the price. If you were, let's imagine you were living in 1860 and you're in New York and you wanted to have a conversation with someone in San Francisco, face to face or voice communication. The only way to do it was to hop on a covered wagon, drive across the country, or take a boat around South America over to San Francisco. That would cost about $20,000 in today's dollars, one direction. Now you get to San Francisco, you deliver your message and have to find $20,000 in 4 months to get routed back to New York. Incredibly expensive, time consuming. Long telephone in late 1800s, even in the beginning, telephones were pretty expensive. So back in the beginning of telephones, to make a 10-minute phone call from New York to the West Coast cost about $2,000 in today's dollars. Now, as the technology developed and the infrastructure was built out, that price dropped precipitously. So much so that in the early 2000s, the government stopped tracking the price altogether. Because it became pretty much free. Now, again, let me ask you the question: when we can communicate with anyone in the world for free anytime, how does that change things? And the answer is we don't know yet. We're going to find out over the next decade.
It would not surprise you that when I arrived here as an instructor, I was given a blank sheet and I had to fill one out every month. I'd keep a log of my telephone calls, the elapsed time, and someone then in another office would estimate the cost of these things. And it would come back. It would come out of my budget for every phone call.
Easy.
Yeah, so I found it easier to take some quarters and go down to the payphone. I didn't do that anymore.
Well, yes. Let me show you another one. This one's a little bit hard, maybe a little bit hard to read on the screen, but this may be my favorite chart of all time. Now, this is calculating world GDP over the last 2,000 years. This is an impossible number to calculate, but it's probably directionally correct. World GDP meaning how wealthy are we as humanity over time? And you will see this chart. This is not linear growth. That part of the chart where we are living now today, we're dramatically wealthier than people were 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, even 20 or 30 years ago. And when I look at this chart, what I realize is there's no reason to expect that the fundamental causes of that growth in wealth have changed. And it's interesting to think about 100 years from now, how much wealthier our grandchildren or grandchildren will be. It's hard to comprehend. But what we do know, again, the world is going to be much weirder than we can imagine. It's getting here faster because of these exponential growth curves. This is a good way to think about it. In the moment when we're living through these things, it feels like slight changes, steady changes. If you're aware enough to pick these things up, you'll see the changes. You'll think about and remember that maybe 20 years ago, people around me were eating different food or whatever. It feels like gradual growth. What is actually happening is things are changing exponentially. Our brains just have a hard time perceiving and understanding it because our brains don't work that way. The world is gathering a lot more knowledge and a lot more wealth. And I take comfort in that, knowing that the world as a result is hopefully better prepared for unpredictable problems that are going to arise. Now, let's go back to running big corporations, small companies for that matter too. There's kind of two approaches you can take when you think about, they know who Jack Welch was. Jack Welch was a famous CEO of General Electric. If you want a fun experience, listen to the audio version of his book on excellence. He does the narration in his New York accent, which you just don't hear very often anymore. It's fun. He's an amazing leader. He was able to get people to do incredible things. But on this point, he was incredibly wrong. And in fact, I would say that what he says here was actually evil in its own way. Unintentionally. He meant well, But she said variance is evil. When she said that, what he meant was in General Electric, their goal was to remove error entirely from the system of the company. We want to get rid of variance. We want to make everything as predictable as possible, because in making the business predictable, that will ensure its duration for a long time. We can steer clear of problems. The reality is that these systems that are so sterile that avoid problems like that are not places where people thrive. It's not places where people innovate. And it's not a place where people learn. That organization fails to learn. And I would argue that she did tremendous damage to long-term durability of General Electric with this stance.
I interviewed him on a stage in New York, and I said, "Is there work balance for the employees of General Electric?" And in his Providence accent, he said, "We have work-life balance at GE. Hit your numbers." And so you knew which side of that he came down on.
There was clarity around what he expected.
And as a result, people didn't stay very long. A lot of good managers had GE in their DNA. They learned all they think they can learn or all they could take, and they moved on.
Yeah. I think he did a lot of damage to U.S. corporations broadly because of that.
Yeah, I would agree.
I contrast this with what Reed Hastings says here. Remember Reed Hastings? He's the founder of a company called Netflix. Yeah. Now, good communications case study. So Reed founded Netflix and helped scale the business. And Netflix is an example of a large company that's gone through 3 fundamental transformations from one primary business model to another, right? They started out doing shipping physical DVDs, and then they started doing digital delivery, controversially so at the time. Their stock price tanked when he announced it. And then they went from digital distribution of content to now production of content. Major shift in their business model. Now, Netflix, you would argue, is at a point where they probably need to transform again with AI-generated content and gaming and all these things, competing for what they do. Will they be able to make that transformation again? I don't know. Reed isn't there anymore. We'll see. Reed had a philosophy of Netflix that said, in the long term, fertile, repeat sterile. What he meant by that, he used to say, we're willing to embrace a certain amount of chaos as long as that chaos is fertile, because in the act, fertile will be sterile. What he realized was that chaos, that fertility, is what exists in a company that is alive, that is learning, that is able to adapt and deal with any problems or opportunities that might arise. Contrast that with GE, an organization that is sterile. That organization is not learning. That organization is exceptionally prepared for the way the world exists in this moment right now. But the second a crisis comes, think about Vallejo, where anything changes, that company is not prepared and not ready. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Amazon jungle. This is a picture I took. It's an amazing place. My oldest son is currently a student at Purdue, getting ready to go do his PhD in entomology, which is the study of insects, not words. Sometimes gets confused. Ever since he's 3 years old, he's been fascinated by bugs. And so when he was graduating from high school, he said, I really would want to go down to the Amazon and hunt for insects. And I thought that sounded insane. But I went and did it. It turned out to be amazing. If you ever get the chance, we went down to this place in Peru. It's about a 60 square mile area that was more biodiverse than any other place on the planet, because the climate in that little area stayed relatively stable for eons. A lot of the rest of the Amazon dried up, got wet again, got up and down. This little part stayed relatively stable. So there's more species of insects, of birds, of monkeys in this little 60 square mile area than anywhere else in the world. It's an amazing place. And so we went looking for insects. And the way you do that, if you're crazy enough, you go out, you stretch a bed sheet between 2 trees, and you shine a light on the sheet, and within minutes, it's covered by insects. Now, at the time, I had no idea I would ever be using these pictures at a presentation. I would have taken better photos if I'd known that. But this was taken right after we turned the light on. Within a couple of minutes after this, the thing was covered. I was out there with head to toe, just covered up. The only thing visible to the air, my eyeballs. My son's out there in shorts and a t-shirt, just loving it. Flies all over him. It's crazy. But what was interesting is we saw insects of every kind of variety you could imagine. Some insects designed to blend in, some insects designed to stick out, all sorts of crazy, weird appendages. And it is amazing to see the type of variety of life that exists in the Amazon jungle. I would argue that it is this variety of life in the Amazon jungle that makes that ecosystem so resilient. Despite what we might do as humans to the Amazon, it's going to do it for a very long time because of this variety. And so the question is, what leads to this variety? How does this happen? If it's this variety, this experimentation that leads to the resilience, what causes this experimentation? And this is evolution in the Amazon. And what's interesting to observe is that this evolution is not done in a planned way. There's no central committee in the Amazon determining which organisms are going to do what. It's a random walk from where the ecosystem exists right now. Experimentation in the form of mutation happens at the level of organisms or even individual cells. And these mutations lead to new discoveries by the ecosystem of what forms of life are possible. If you mutate enough, eventually you discover that light exists, for example, and having eyeballs can be a useful thing. Now, some people would say there is a point in this evolution, and it's how we're the best form of an organism that can survive and thrive in this environment. I would argue that's not true. The best form of an organism in this environment is probably single-celled organisms that are incredibly hardy and that reproduce very well. If that were the objective, this evolution would have stopped with single-celled organisms. So all this variety is a testament to the fact that something else is going on. This is the ecosystem gathering knowledge about the way the world works through a random walk of experimentation. Now, just think about that for a second, because I'm going to contrast it with the way that we innovate inside of our organizations in pursuit of resilience. We do everything in the exact opposite way from how this happens in natural systems. In the Amazon, there are no objectives, only constraints, meaning there's no objective to that evolutionary process. There are constraints. There's only a certain amount of water, a fluid of sunlight that the organisms have to compete for. And it's that competition that leads to increase in fitness, these organisms that survive. In our organizations, innovation is always objective driven, meaning it's in the pursuit of specific goals. And as a result, it's far from prolific. Now, it's hard to imagine ways in which, if we had more time for a whole other lecture, what we might do is talk about how do you innovate in a way where it's not objectives driven inside a company. We do have constraints in our companies in terms of the amount of capital and time we could spend on different things. So there are constraints like in the Amazon way, but we need to think about ways that we might do more innovating without objectives. And there's some amazing stories in history. Some of the greatest inventions that we enjoy came from that type of random walk and discovery. Number two, in the Amazon, experimentation happens at the margins. So we're talking about just at the level of individual cells or organisms. And if that experimentation, that mutation fails, that's too bad for the organism or the cell involved, right? But if it succeeds, the ecosystem is poised to adopt it and let it proliferate. Inside of our large companies, because we're so focused on capital efficiency and safety, what happens is we centralize innovation and experimentation. And whether it succeeds or fails, it's incredibly expensive. A friend of mine who runs innovation inside a huge multinational company told me once that his company, he said, that is not what you want. You want this. Not what Amazon does. Number three, novelty compounds over time. What I mean by that is that mutation that happens leads to a discovery about some form of life that's possible. And then that form of life mutates further. That novelty, that gathering of knowledge compounds over time and becomes useful. Jim mentioned I used to work with this amazing man named Clay Christensen, one of my heroes. Just as a quick aside, the book I need really the most often is a wonderful book he wrote called How Would You Measure Your Life? Cannot recommend it highly enough. Clay was a professor at the Harvard Business School and an expert in innovation. I came up with the idea of disruptive innovation in his doctoral thesis back in 1997. And Clay, an amazing thing about Clay. In fact, so much so that he had a sign that he made outside his office. He used to love doing woodworking. He had a sign outside his office that said, he'd carved the wood, "Anomalies Wanted." And he took that very seriously. If you could come to him and tell him some way in which his theories were incorrect or wrong, he'd wrecked it, because it was that process that made the theory stronger, more applicable to the real world. We should be in the search of that type of anomaly of learning. It's that novelty, that knowledge compounds over time and becomes very important. So the way that you make serendipity happen, that serendipity that drives resilience, is you run experiments designed to uncover anomalies. Now, let's think about what experiments is. Some actual intent where you're going to happen on. In our personal lives, we run experiments all the time Often the experiments that we run are designed to reinforce what we already know, to make us feel better about our decisions or what we think. The same is true in our companies. When I did this presentation to corporate executives that said, we run lots of experiments in our company. The problem is most of those experiments are designed to reinforce what the corporation already believes about how the world works. Experiments should be designed to uncover anomalies, to challenge the things that we know or think about the way the world works. That is how we learn. Being back to our weightlifter friend, put the system under stress and challenge what you think as a way to learn. Those anomalies generate knowledge. It's that knowledge that leads to insight as it compounds. And it's the insight that generates serendipity that enables us to be in the right time, in the right place to do new things with the opportunities and problems that arise. So just a word on experiments. We're going to go to questions here in a second. Experiments should be fast, cheap, and weird. And what I mean by that, fast, quick iteration cycles, especially in a world that's driven by AI and with that the rate of change of progress increasing, we have to get faster and faster at learning to be able to stay on top. Experiments should be cheap. They should be expensive. The equivalent of happening at the level of cells or organisms, but in our own lives, by the way, as well as in our organizations. Number three, but should be weird.
What do you make of the experiment that was hundreds of billions of dollars for a micro momentary glimpse of a proton?
Yeah. We'll see how useful that is over time.
Okay.
You'll see relative to, I'll give you a quick example of this. A kind of learning that can generate from small experiments. Let's do a thought experiment for a minute. Let's imagine you could travel back to the 80s and you go back to the 1850s and you tell people in 2025, we had this amazing invention called a microwave. It's awesome. Can heat up our food really quickly. It makes life so much easier. You all need microwaves in 1850. You should have read microwaves. And so what they would do is they'd set about, okay, microwaves are a big objective. Let's invent microwaves. That does sound really useful. 0% chance with microwaves in mind that they would be able to invent microwaves if you told them about it, because a microwave is based on all sorts of building blocks that had to happen along the way. So I'm going to have vacuum tubes and then electricity and all these things in that collection of building blocks over time. And so these little experiments, these little random things that happen that direction lead to the big outcome. A friend of mine wrote a great, highly recommend, he's a researcher at OpenAI, and not at OpenAI, but big AI researcher named Ken Stanley, wrote a book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, about that he learned and trained computers how to think about how to achieve big outcomes, and found that and documented with amazing, it's a counterintuitive idea where you're taught to set big goals and do big things, and that's how you achieve big things. What he found is that random walk is more likely to achieve big outcomes. That's cool. Anyway, so weird experiments. You should be running experiments to challenge status quo thinking. All right. So just to summarize, this is important as we think about over 10 years hence. There is no data about the future. You can sit and go look for as much data to predict the world as you can. It only tells you about the world as it has existed in the past or exists currently. The only way you get data about the future is by creating it. And you create data about the future by taking action. Action creates data. That data creates knowledge. That knowledge compounds over time like any asset. It's the experiments that help us uncover knowledge that we need, the knowledge and the wealth that we need to deal with any problem that might arise. So run fast, cheap, weird experiments. Okay, one last quote. I live in Indiana, as you all do too. John Wooden famously grew up in Indiana. I also went to UCLA, where John Wooden is a big deal because he was the basketball coach there for a long time ago. But he had a quote he used to say all the time, but he learned from his basketball coach at Purdue. The team that makes the most mistakes usually wins because doers make mistakes. That is a counterintuitive idea. The team that makes the most, the only thing for a coach to say, but he's right. The team that makes the most mistakes wins because doers make mistakes. Action creates data. So if you want to be prepared for the future, what you need to be doing is taking action to gather as much knowledge and wealth as you can to be prepared for anything that might arise. That's true at an individual level. It's true at a company level. It's true at a societal level. Action creates data. We're going to make mistakes along the way. Problems are inevitable, but it's in uncovering problems. Those problems become the drivers of progress that we need to rely on and advance. Okay. Enough of me talking. Let's see questions. I'll put my contact info up here too.
Hello. The pandemic obviously But it was an experiment since need to experiment and mistakes were high. But what do you think we learned out of that 3 to 4 year period?
I don't know. It's a good question. We'll see how much we learned over the next decade. In my conversations with corporate executives, I will tell you the shift on the focus on efficiency to resilience resonates because of the direct experience they had during COVID. Take supply chains as a specific example. You go to supply chain conferences right now. If you come to supply chain conferences 5, 10 years ago, all anybody talked about was supply chain efficiency. You go to conferences now, they're talking about some redundancy is okay because you leave resilient supply chain turns out to be more important in the long run. I don't know. There's structural impediments. We think about return on invested capital as the primary method by which we measure success in companies. I don't think it should be, but there are structural impediments to changing that. I did some interesting research over the last couple of years into the world's longest lived companies as a way to just understand what are they doing differently. The company in the world, by the way, was started 100 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. Started in Japan, family-owned construction company, Condor Goody is its name. Started in Japan in the 600s. And you think about a business like that, what they had to overcome and do to last to endure that long. The business, by the way, just a quick side note on that, did effectively go out of business in like 2001, 2002, because they were burdened by debt that they couldn't pay off in the middle of a crisis. They're still in operation, but they got acquired. They're not operating as an independent company anymore. I think a lot about the guy who was the 41st person in that family line who was watching the business when it failed. Can you imagine that pressure? Knowing your family to run this thing since the 600. Anyway, but if you look at some of these companies, they have certain things in common that enable them to endure and last. In the case of a lot of these Japanese companies, which you look at the list of the 100 longest lived companies in the world, a good portion of them are Japanese. And some of the things they do really interesting. There's this idea among companies that's quite common called Sampo Yoshi, which is you run a business to benefit not just your owners, but your customers. That's just all three things have to. And we see companies that size profitability in the near benefit of their don't endure. They can earn too much profit. And something the society determines that they're earning too much money. They're not producing enough surplus for society. They get shut down, either because they're not shuts down or something else happens. These companies in Japan also, it was interesting to watch. They understand that crises come regularly. If you move through enough big crises like the COVID, you recognize that you need to be prepared. There's a professor in Korea who was looking at some of these companies in Japan coming out of COVID, saying like, how did you prepare for this? They said, oh, we knew big crises like this come about every 15 years. And so we maintain a stockpile of cash just for these types of events. And you talked to one manufacturing company in Japan that said, without any revenue at all, we've got enough capital on hand to last for 22 years. That's probably extreme. But it shows the mentality. There's this other really interesting idea too in these organizations that go through multiple crises like this. When you were a couple of years ago, we do a big innovation conference every year. I just built my company. And one of the speakers who came was in charge of innovation for the Queen of England. She got up on stage, this amazing British accent. Her job was to figure out how to have the Queen of England, the royal family, innovate. And to boil it down, her job was to determine what needs to stay fixed and never change. And then what do we put in the category of we deliberately need to adjust and change. We find in organizations that do it for a long time, they've got a pretty good sense of what must stay the same and remain true always. But then also recognizing that everything else has to change, and they're pretty good at doing that. I could also go on and on. So I think there's something there more, but the idea that resilience matters more than efficiency right now. I think there are structural impediments to having that broadly adopted.
Relative to that, we had a conversation about at the University of Pennsylvania. She said one of the things she learned, she won the Nobel Prize in 23 for the COVID vaccine. One of the things she learned was, she said, we are taking far too long to prove things we already know. And I said, but don't you want to be careful? She said, Jonas Salk took 12 years. I took 12 months. 12 months to develop this way to change the protein.
Yeah, I tell my team all the time, safety is unsafe.
Yeah, that's playing not to lose almost.
Which is a certain path to failure.
Other questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask. What's your take on like a lot of companies right now deciding to just hire like huge amount of their workforce? Let's say like Twitter, for instance. Yeah, like a lot of other tech companies doing that.
Yeah, it depends on what the objective is. Facebook's a great example of this. They went through and reduced their workforce by a third a few years ago, purposefully as a way to generate more capital. Now, you could argue that they were doing that just for the purpose of giving that back to investors in the near term. That would be a good idea. That'd be an example of capital efficiency gone right. But what they did instead, they took the cash flow from that operational change and are now plowing it into AI experimentation. So Meta invested $40 billion last year in AI experiments. That is a crazy number. And even if half of that ends up being wasted, okay, they invested $20 billion in AI experimentation last year. That is hard for almost any other organization to compete with. That is driving, they're doing that to drive resilience. If you think about it that way, I wouldn't want to compete with Meta head on when it comes to AI, the way that they're trying to do it. They may be wrong over time and in the other ways, other approaches, but I think they've got a pretty good shot of succeeding in the next decade. Hopefully doing. So it depends on the objective, I think. Yeah, GE did the same thing, right? Got their workforce way down to a kind of bare bones as a way to drive capital efficiency for the purpose of it's to distribute back and it doesn't create long-term resilience.
Thank you.
Other thoughts, things on your mind.
I like your example of the Amazon sort of as that metaphor for innovation. One of the things I've seen in big companies is when the experimentation does happen, and innovation does happen, there's sort of a rejection of it where it's hard to get it to bubble throughout the rest of the organization. Have you seen any big companies that are doing that very well? And if so, what's different about that?
Yeah, it's really hard. The idea, if you think about, if you just kind of mental framework, thinking about these big companies, right? Every one of these big companies began as a startup with some secret they discovered and began exploring and doing something different the world loved and rewarded them for. Those companies then grew, expanded, and as they grew, they developed systems of governance, weighted load precision, systems of incentives. They hired certain types of people and put in place processes designed to preserve what had been built, to propagate what had been built and being safe. It's interesting. If you look at anybody working inside a big company will complain all the time how it takes so long for us to make decisions, the bureaucracy is stifled. That is a feature of those systems. That is not a bug, because those systems are designed to operate safely, to make decisions slowly. Now, that is completely opposed. That type of system is completely opposed to what you need to do to innovate. Innovation is not capital efficient. Innovation requires making mistakes, as we've talked about. Innovation requires learning, challenging status quo. Startups do this really well. They just right now. And so when we work with organizations, I'll tell you, just working with Craig Christensen. So I spent 7 years with him going around and working with large organizations, trying to help them be more innovative. And these companies would come to us and say, we need to transform our business because we're worried about the future. There's this new competitive threat. And so our standard answer at the time was, okay, let's set an innovation. First of all, let's develop a strategy for how to then approach these threats or opportunities. That's, in some cases, set up an innovation team that's kind of focus on identifying new business models and things you might do differently, and give that innovation team some budget, let them work, change to work, whatever. And they'll come up with things that will help your business transform. There's not a single, every corporation in the world now does this stuff. And there's not a single example that I can think of that approach leading to the fundamental transformation of corporation. Not one. And that is extremely distressing to me. And it was extremely distressing to Clay when we were talking about it, because we thought that would be the solution. It turns out that innovator's dilemma is a much harder problem than anybody thought. The innovator's dilemma is the idea that management companies can do everything right in terms of expanding what they deliver to their best customers and growing profits. And that will 100% of the time lead to the failure of the business. And so the challenge is, as you move up market, you serve your best customers ever more profitably, you leave yourself exposed at the low end to new entrants who can come in with a good enough base hold in the market and then move up market themselves over to place the income. It's a really hard problem to solve. So what we found about this problem for the last 15, 20 years, I designed my current business high out innovation in direct response to that issue. We build startups outside of that system of governance, incentives, people, process that has been designed for optimization of for preserving this thing that's already just optimizing for capital efficiency. What we realize is we've given up on, you can't change that system. You can't repurpose it to do certain types of innovation. You can for sure improve on the margins and do things incrementally better. Corporations are exceptional at that. But when it comes to fundamentally different business models, you can't, you just can't do it inside a corporation. I'm of the mind now where you have to take it out entirely. We do it through the vehicle of startups, because startups learn really quickly. Startups in which the corporation has a minority interest. They do enough of these things, they can learn a lot faster, plow those lessons back into the core, helping strategic optionality for the future. It's not perfect, but it's the best solution I've seen so far.
It's hard to get those things to go because a well-established, very large, complex organization resists that. I was on an advisory committee at McDonald's some years ago, and one of the things that they knew with certainty was that the great innovations in this massive restaurant operation didn't come from the Oak headquarters. It came from the operators. An operator put together the first Big Mac. An operator put together the Egg McMuffin because he was dealing with customers who wanted breakfast. Hey, cut me some eggs. He's got the guy right there at the counter. The folks in the headquarters, they would test it, and it would take forever to roll it out to the whole corporation. The fellow who sent his kids to school here said, why don't we put a certain amount of innovation in the hands of the operators? And it turns out they were coming up with good ideas, but the organization itself was killing them.
Yeah, you want variants. I love baseball. Any baseball fans in here? There's a good example there. So Ted Williams,
Last man.
last man to bat about 400 in Major League Baseball. I think it was 1941 when he did it.
1960 that's the 400 career. He went out hitting a home run in October of 60.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing player.
Everybody wants to go out like Ted.
Yeah. And he took chances. And that last season, when last player Major League Baseball got 400. It was the last game of the season. He was at point, which you landed up to 400. 4 out of 10 times he was at bat. He got a hit. Right. And his coach said, don't go play in the game. Don't go at bat. I just go there. It was bench you for this game today. We're 400. This is a big deal. A lot of many people have done this. So you can lock it in. He said, no way. I got to play the whole season. I'm going to play a game today. I think that day he went 4 for 6 and got something like that. Got his average up to 406 for the season. Last person to do it. And the thing that's interesting about that is baseball players have only got better since then. If you took a baseball player from 2025 and dropped him back down in the 1940s, they'd crush it. They'd be so good. So what happened over time was that as performance has increased among baseball players, as I said, pitchers gotten better, hitters gotten better. The band of performance has also gotten narrower, meaning there's less variance, there are fewer outliers in terms of the performance. And as a result, you don't see that broad spectrum of super amazing feats of performance like you did back in the 1940s. The same is true in our companies. When a company like McDonald's gets better at operating this global system of restaurants, performance gets better, but the band of performance gets narrower. You have less variance in the system. And so as a result, you're less likely to learn things. You're less likely to have a franchisee somewhere who has the freedom to do some crazy thing that gets picked up by the system. It's a huge problem. You need variance.
I'm sorry to meet you a challenge of interviews. And I love your Amazon music. So I'm going to make a mistake. That's biology. And I would say, if I take that biology from the 3 rules that you had, then I can't go with those theories. I would make my whole rules because businesses are made of organisms. They're made up of us, and we're made of organisms. And we are biology. And if we could find a more, I don't want to say appropriate, but just something closer to what biology is. And I would dare say there might be being value-centered missions. If you do, that will allow you, and you let the people governed by that. And that's what those insects are doing in Amazon. There are very few rules.
Yeah.
And having a rule is popping up.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. A lot of truth in that. Back to What's the primary objective for most companies? There's a great article just a couple of days ago, actually, in the Financial Times on this. The headline of the article was "Large Manufacturers Have Forgotten What They Exist For." And the article talked about, it's one I know Rita McGrath was great. The article talked about how these large organizations have decided that their objective, or reason they exist, is to generate profit. And they've forgotten that there was a time not long ago when the purpose was to generate technological advancements for society. Actually, it was a byproduct of that. And in that flipping, they've lost the sense of who they really are.
And that's what those Japanese companies are doing too.
Yeah. Now, they are very good at remembering what uses, where it is to say who and what you choose. But yeah, a good example of this modern Jeff Bezos, as CEO of Amazon, used to say that Amazon's competitive edge was that it thought in really long time cycles. The goal was just to outlast everybody. And he was comfortable getting pilloried by the markets for years because he was plowing every set they had back in the group. Should were playing a long game. I remember he went to a town hall with his employees. It was just that Amazon's just crushing it. They're doing amazingly well. He gets up in front of the employees at the town hall and says, "Amazon's going bankrupt." And they said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Yeah, Amazon's going to go out of business one day."
We know, and I know you know, 27 years was an officer at Sears Roebuck out in the south of Chicago. When I was a boy, everybody either shopped at Sears or knew somebody who worked there, and they were the universal retailer. And Ron and I were having a drink after dinner not long ago. He said, "We have the catalog, we have the stores, with the employees, with the supply chain. Hell, we could send you a house. You could put it out." He said, "What we didn't have was imagination." And then we could have been Amazon. We could have been Amazon, and the people at the top, no imagination and a refusal to take chances.
And somebody come along. Maybe one of you will figure out a way to disrupt Amazon, come up with something better. Amazon will say we could have been that.
Yeah, I worked for Exxon for 30 years, and your point about it's hard to innovate in a big company or corporation. We tried to expand the organization, and we started Exxon Nuclear, and we were selling typewriters, and we were making graphite golf clubs and tennis rackets, and none of it worked, and none of it made any money. We just struck it all back to our core business and got rid of a lot of people, and because it just didn't fit. And we never went back.
It's interesting. Yeah, and it's when I speak with the corporate executives on this topic, it's very easy to draw the wrong conclusion. Chaos is good. Like, okay, we've been operating in an efficiency mindset. Well, the other end of the spectrum is full on chaos, right? Complete dive into chaos is also bad. I'll do a sports analogy again for a second, but 3-point rule in NBA is a great example of teaches the lesson on a principle where you want to be on a spectrum of full chaos or full efficiency. There's the 3-point rule didn't always exist in the NBA. It was started in the 1979 season. Quite controversially, this was introduced as a way to make the game a little more exciting. And the 3-point rule is there's a line drawn on the court. So it's beyond that point. If you make a shot, you get 3 points. If you're from the line, you get 2 points. And when it was first introduced, people thought this isn't really going to change the game. In fact, there's a funny quote from the guy who that first year was the top 3-point scorer in the country. They're just going to be up again. But if you look at the game over time, it's radically changed. Probably the biggest change to a professional sport rule change in the last 60 years. And what's happened to the game of basketball now, for better or for worse, all the shots are taken right by the net or just beyond the 3-point line. In fact, the last company to win, or the last team to win a game without taking any 3-point shots at all was back in 2014. That's never going to happen again. You've got to be really good at taking shots strategically and taking a lot of them. So the point of this is what the teams that win in this era of the 3-point rule are the teams that take the most shots and that take them strategically. So often people misinterpret this as thinking, well, we just need to run more experiments. The reality is you got to do it within your constraints and it align with your strategy. So companies, for sure need to be taking more of the equivalent of 3-point shots. It's more experiments, but also strategic. Because you might argue maybe graphite tennis rackets that wasn't strategically aligned or other experiments could have been performed more strategically. That would have driven more. Yeah, questions? Comments, though?
Okay, we'll give you one more chance. Ladies and gentlemen, Elliott Parker. Thank you. Thank you for being here.